For years, royal watchers assumed unity. Two senior women of the crown, both once outsiders, both seemingly aligned. But behind palace walls, a frost lingered. Duchess Sophie has finally spoken, and her chilling revelation about Camilla has sent tremors through the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Sophie, the poised and often under-celebrated Duchess of Edinburgh, had long been considered the monarchy's quiet anchor, loyal, dutiful, graceful under pressure. Her path into the royal fold was one of subtle persistence and earned respect, never rushed, never loud. And over time, she carved out a trusted space in the late Queen Elizabeth's inner circle, a rare feat in a world defined by cold traditions and shifting loyalties. But while Sophie quietly built her influence through service and steadiness, another woman was rewriting her own royal script. Camilla, whose very name once sparked scandal, was slowly, relentlessly, ascending toward the throne. From the margins of infamy, she became queen consort. Yet even as the press spun tales of redemption and acceptance, behind closed doors, the atmosphere was far from harmonious. Over the years, whispers of tension between Sophie and Camilla would flicker in tabloid shadows before being quickly extinguished by palace spokespeople. They smiled together, stood side by side at events, even shared carriages, but the warmth was missing. Insiders would describe their interactions as polite but distant, the kind of distance that is carefully curated, never acknowledged. But now, everything has changed. With one unexpected and deliberately calculated statement, Sophie has pierced the veil of royal silence. Not just a subtle nod, not a hint, but a direct admission. Her relationship with Camilla was never close. In fact, it was cold, disconnected, and quietly painful. Why now? That's the question gripping both the media and the monarchy. What shattered Sophie's resolve? What force compelled her to break a centuries-old tradition of discretion and unveil the truth? For years, she played the game of silence, adhering to the unwritten code that binds royal women. Endure in silence, sacrifice, without complaint. But that code, it seems, has been broken, and not by accident. This was a decision forged in years of quiet resentment and accumulated slights. A truth sharpened by repeated exclusion and cloaked rivalry, and now it's a truth impossible to ignore. The palace, predictably, has responded with carefully measured silence. No direct denial, no rebuttal, just a fog of official statements thanking both women for their service and dedication, as if generic praise could extinguish the blaze that Sophie's words have ignited. But this isn't just a spat between royal figures. It's a crack in the foundation. A public acknowledgement of emotional distance at the heart of the monarchy's most senior circle. It's left the firm shaken, the public divided, and the press ravenous. But to understand why Duchess Sophie finally shattered the silence, we must rewind to the very moment her fate collided with Camilla's in a battle neither woman anticipated. Every royal encounter is choreographed to perfection. But the first meeting between Sophie and Camilla was anything but harmonious. It was the beginning of a quiet war that would shape two destinies, one crowned, one sidelined. The setting may have looked elegant from the outside. Royal protocol followed. Smiles exchanged, the occasional whisper over a program. But underneath the polished exterior, the energy between Sophie and Camilla was unmistakably strained. It was during their first official joint appearance, years before either woman had found her place within the monarchy's brutal hierarchy, that the temperature dropped. Sophie, eager to extend the kind of warmth that had earned her the Queen's quiet trust, reached out with openness and grace. Camilla, however, met her with an unreadable expression. Her replies clipped, her tone measured, guarded, distant, almost rehearsed. What should have been the start of a natural alliance between two women navigating a male-dominated institution quickly transformed into a frigid standoff. Palace aides, sharp-eyed and trained to read the subtleties others miss, noticed it immediately. Glances exchanged, shoulders turned ever so slightly away. Long silences during engagements meant to demonstrate unity. But when whispers of discomfort reached the upper echelons of palace management, they were swiftly silenced. The royal family, especially in the wake of years of scandal, could not afford another narrative of division. So the official story was spun. Two dedicated women, each devoted to service, working in harmony. But behind the scenes, something else was taking root: resentment. Competition. A slow, creeping realization that the royal spotlight might not have a room for both. As Camilla's relationship with Charles solidified, and her position within the firm became more secure, her demeanor seemed to shift. Her presence was no longer tentative. She moved with quiet authority, commanding rooms with the backing of the future king. Sophie, meanwhile, was still building her place through relentless commitment and discretion. The contrast was stark. Camilla rose through proximity, Sophie through performance. And that contrast didn't just define them, it divided them. Camilla began to assert control over social dynamics, often arriving late to engagements, overshadowing moments meant for others, while Sophie continued to show up early, prepared, and unassuming. It wasn't just personal, it was strategic. Slowly, the chessboard was being rearranged, and Sophie began to realize she wasn't being invited to play. The press, ever hungry but still tethered by royal influence, painted them as allies, occasionally nodding to differences in style, but never daring to suggest the truth, that there was no closeness, no friendship, no real trust. The public image of unity was meticulously staged, but behind closed doors, that image was fracturing. The gloved hands, the coordinated colors, the curated smiles, they were all part of a performance. But Sophie, despite her grace, could feel it. She could feel the growing chill each time Camilla stepped into a room. She could feel her space shrinking, her voice quieting, her relevance being rewritten. And while the public remained blind to the brewing storm, inside palace corridors, Camilla was already pulling strings, and Sophie felt the shift. She wasn't born into royalty. She wasn't embraced at first. But Camilla played the long game and won. And as she ascended in the shadows, Sophie watched her own influence slowly evaporate. While the world was still debating Camilla's place in the royal fold, behind the scenes, she was already weaving a web of quiet influence. With surgical precision, she cultivated allies inside the palace, senior courtiers, seasoned advisors, even those who had once been loyal to other royal branches. She understood the real power wasn't in titles, but in access to decisions, to the monarch, to the rooms where influence lived and future narratives were shaped. Camilla's rise wasn't built on public affection, it was engineered through calculated moves and silent partnerships. And at the same time, Sophie, who had earned her place through decades of dedication, started noticing the ground shift beneath her feet. In the early years, Sophie had captured hearts. The late queen had a clear fondness for her, often entrusting her with delicate tasks and seeking her presence during key moments. The public admired her sincerity, her poise, her quiet competence, but as the balance of power within the royal household began tilting toward Camilla's inner circle, Sophie's prominence began to wane. Without confrontation or scandal, her influence was quietly stripped away. It began subtly: patronages reallocated, appearances restructured, engagements reassigned. One by one, the platforms Sophie had built over years of quiet service were handed elsewhere, and every change came dressed as restructuring, every removal buried beneath bureaucratic courtesy. Then came the meetings. Once a regular presence at high-level discussions, Sophie now found herself on the outside looking in. Invitations stopped arriving. Briefings were missed, and when she questioned these shifts, the responses were vague, evasive, logistical oversights, calendar conflicts, seniority adjustments. But behind those words was Camilla's growing reach, her slow consolidation of authority, not just in the eyes of the king, but in the machinery that kept the monarchy moving. There were even whispered accounts never confirmed, always denied, that Camilla had personally intervened to keep Sophie away from certain high-profile events, ensuring her own spotlight remained unchallenged. The toll was invisible to most, but undeniable to those close to Sophie. The once unshakable Duchess began retreating, cancelling appearances, avoiding internal functions, even spending longer periods in the countryside, away from the suffocating politics of palace life. Her public image remained intact, but inside, the cracks were forming. This wasn't just about prestige or assignments, it was about erosion, a slow, almost imperceptible dismantling of everything she had built. And through it all, Camilla stood untouched, rising higher with every step, cloaked in the appearance of acceptance, while Sophie faded quietly into the background of her own story. But it wasn't just about power, it was personal. The betrayal Sophie felt ran deeper than royal duties. It struck at the heart of trust. In a moment of quiet despair, Sophie approached the one person who truly saw her, the late Queen. What she revealed would forever change how the monarch viewed her family and how close Sophie came to leaving it all behind. Years of silent endurance had finally worn Sophie down. The endless cycle of smiles that masked exclusion, the grace under pressure that concealed humiliation, and the relentless comparisons to a woman who had maneuvered herself into power, it had become unbearable. For all her dedication, Sophie had become a ghost within the walls of her own institution. Every patronage she once led, every event she once anchored, was either stripped away or strategically overshadowed, and yet she never spoke publicly. But in private, she was unraveling. Behind the walls of Bagshot Park, she began to retreat not out of petulance, but out of self-preservation. Friends grew concerned, staff noticed the change, and finally, Sophie, ever loyal, did the one thing that defied every protocol. She asked for an audience not as a duchess, but as a woman at her limit. It was during one of their quieter afternoons, just the two of them, that Sophie laid it bare. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with years of suppressed disappointment. She spoke of feeling erased, of watching her work be dismantled, her presence diminished, and her purpose questioned. She confessed her growing resentment not just toward Camilla's ascent, but toward the machinery that allowed it without question. She admitted, in a whisper thick with grief, that she had thought about stepping away. Not because she no longer cared, but because she no longer mattered. The Queen listened, silent, still, and unshaken. There was no rebuke, no defense of Camilla, just a hand on Sophie's own and a quiet acknowledgement that carried the weight of generations. "I see you. I always have." But comfort was not confrontation, and Sophie knew the Queen's power was not in opposition, but in quiet reinforcement. Soon after, Sophie withdrew to Bagshot Park under the pretense of rest. But in truth, it was an emotional retreat, a desperate bid to remember who she was before the palace politics began to hollow her out. It was during this time that rumours swirled, that she was on the verge of stepping back, that talks had taken place about reducing her public role, that she might, in time, disappear from royal life altogether. The press speculated wildly, but what they didn't see was the Queen's silent response, assigning Sophie a new, meaningful role. One, not flashy or strategic, but deeply symbolic, a way of keeping her close, of reaffirming her value, of reminding the rest of the family that Sophie was not dispensable. That subtle act was enough. It was the Queen's way of pulling her back from the brink. Sophie returned to duty, not reinvigorated, but resolved. Yet even as she reclaimed her space, something had changed. Her eyes were open now. She no longer believed in the illusion of royal unity. She saw the hierarchy for what it was, a battlefield dressed in etiquette. And while she chose to stay, to endure once more, her silence was no longer a sign of obedience, it was a warning. Yet, as Sophie recommitted to duty, Camilla only grew bolder, and what came next was a silent coup no one saw coming. The coronation was meant to symbolize unity. Instead, it drove the final wedge between two royal women already on opposing sides of an invisible war. What happened that day would haunt Sophie. The tension had been building for weeks, whispers of decisions being made in rooms where Sophie no longer had a seat. Despite decades of service and unwavering dedication, she was being gradually sidelined from one of the most significant moments in modern royal history. The official reason? Logistics. timing, protocol. But behind the sanitized language, the message was unmistakable. Sophie was no longer a central figure in the story. Planning meetings came and went without her input. Assignments for the grand day were made, reshuffled, reassigned until Sophie was left with a role so diminished it barely resembled her stature. And at the heart of every change, every quiet exclusion, stood one woman, Camilla. As the coronation unfolded, what should have been a celebration of tradition became, for Sophie, a cold and public confirmation of her diminished place. The seating arrangements were particularly damning, positioned not among the trusted core, but further down the hierarchy, polite, respectful, but distant. For those who understood the language of royal symbolism, it was a clear snub, a move designed not to humiliate openly, but to reframe perception. She wasn't erased, she was simply made smaller. Camilla, on the other hand, stood triumphant, crowned in gold, flanked by power, cemented in history. Her smile, her poise, her control of the moment. It was the final proof that she had not only risen but conquered, but it was behind the grandeur, away from the ceremony's polished exterior, that the emotional toll erupted. Sophie, holding every ounce of composure during the event, reportedly broke down in private afterward. Those closest to her described her as devastated, not just by the day's symbolism, but by the stark realization that her years of loyalty had bought her silence, not significance. To the public, it seemed like another flawless royal affair. But experts were watching closely. Lip readers analyzed footage of fleeting glances, clipped exchanges, awkward smiles. Body language specialists pointed out the stiffness between Sophie and Camilla, the lack of eye contact, the tension in every choreographed move. It didn't take long for the narrative to shift. Tabloids began speculating. Was there a deeper rift within the royal women? Social media lit up with comparisons, theories, behind-the-scenes leaks. What had once been hidden in silence was now being picked apart, frame by frame. And for the first time, the public began to truly wonder. Were the royals fractured from within? Was the sisterhood they presented merely a facade? And just when it seemed Sophie had learned to suffer in silence, a private recording changed everything. It was never meant to be heard. But when a private recording of Duchess Sophie emerged raw, unfiltered, and furious, the world finally heard what the palace had long tried to conceal. The audio wasn't polished or rehearsed. It wasn't a crafted interview or an offhand remark caught by a mic. It was a candid, deeply emotional outpouring, captured during what was supposed to be a private conversation inside palace walls. The voice, unmistakably Sophie's, trembled not with weakness, but with restrained fury. She spoke of Camilla with words sharper than any royal statement would ever dare. Duplicity, manipulation, calculated charm. Words that shattered the illusion of royal unity and exposed a simmering resentment the world never imagined could exist between two senior women of the crown. The recording, leaked by an unnamed insider whose identity remains a mystery, quickly spread like wildfire. Within hours, it dominated headlines, airwaves, and every corner of social media. The palace scrambled to contain the damage, but the truth had already detonated. Inside royal circles, panic set in. Courtiers whispered of betrayal, of broken trust, of cracks that could no longer be hidden under smiling photographs. Emergency meetings were held. Advisors were summoned in the middle of the night. Camilla's camp allegedly demanded swift retribution, while others pushed for silence, hoping the storm would pass. But this was not a storm easily forgotten. It was an eruption that couldn't be swept under red carpets or buried beneath royal protocols. The tone in Sophie's voice, the specificity of her words, the pain that cut through every sentence, it was too real, too raw, to ignore. The world listened, stunned. Some were outraged, calling it a breach of royal decorum. But many, perhaps most, saw it differently. They heard a woman exhausted by years of quiet endurance. Duchess pushed too far, for too long, and they sympathized. Still, the consequences were immediate. Sophie's advisors went into crisis mode, trying to frame the recording as an emotional moment taken out of context. But the damage was done. The divide was out in the open now. Camilla, for her part, remained silent, refusing to acknowledge the leak or the accusations. And yet, it was her silence that spoke volumes. The woman once deemed unshakable was now under fire from within the very family she had fought to become a part of. Allies began to shift, conversations grew colder, and the once tightly controlled palace narrative slipped further out of the firm's grasp. It was no longer a matter of speculation, it was war by whispers, and Sophie had drawn the first blood in public view. But rather than retreat, Sophie did the unthinkable. She stepped forward, publicly, calmly, and shattered the illusion forever. No royal has dared speak like this before, but Duchess Sophie, measured and resolute, addressed the storm head-on. And in doing so, she rewrote the rules of the firm forever. There was no press conference, no flashy video, just a statement printed, deliberate, and devastating in its calm defiance. In a move that sent tremors through the royal establishment, Sophie released her first direct public response since the explosive leak. And it was unlike anything the monarchy had ever witnessed. There were no apologies, no pleas for forgiveness. Instead, there was truth, sharp, strategic, and impossible to ignore. She referred to her relationship with Camilla as distant. She called the internal dynamics complex. But the most jarring line, the one that echoed across newsrooms and living rooms alike, was this: unchallenged influence cannot coexist with unspoken pain. With that single sentence, Sophie exposed the rot within the gilded walls and forced the public to look beyond the palace facade. The media erupted. Front-page headlines spun endlessly. Morning shows dissected every phrase, and online platforms became battlegrounds of opinion. To some, Sophie was a rebel in pearls, a woman who had stayed silent too long and finally reclaimed her voice. To others, she was a threat to royal stability, a reminder that even the firm's most polished faces could fracture under pressure. But regardless of perspective, one truth was undeniable. Sophie had shattered the silence, and the monarchy would never sound the same again. What made the statement even more powerful was its restraint. There were no personal attacks, no melodrama, just carefully chosen words that sliced through decades of unspoken tension. Inside the palace, the air was different. Cold, unsettled. The official response? A brief and vague acknowledgement thanking Sophie for her years of service and commitment to the crown, nothing more. But that silence wasn't dignified. It was revealing. For royal insiders, the lack of rebuttal signaled something deeper. A fracture, too, a wide to deny. Camilla's team, already reeling from the leaked recording, scrambled to reclaim control. Stories quietly surfaced favorable profiles, sympathetic quotes, carefully timed appearances, but the public wasn't buying it. Accusations of media manipulation followed. Whispers that Camilla's camp was behind a counter-narrative only added fuel to an already raging fire. Meanwhile, Sophie's star began to rise in an unexpected way. Support poured in from royalists, from women's advocacy groups, from former critics who saw, at last, a royal speaking in plain emotional truth. Hashtags surged. Opinion polls shifted. For the first time, voices outside the palace were calling for Sophie to take on greater responsibility within the firm. Not just as a symbol of grace, but as a representative of integrity. She had survived exile in plain sight. Now, she stood transformed not as a victim, but as a force. But behind the scenes, this public reckoning ignited an even deeper crisis, one that could jeopardize the very structure of the monarchy. With one confession, Sophie cracked the royal foundation, and the tremors are still being felt. Camilla's camp is furious. Charles is conflicted. William is caught in the crossfire, and the future of the monarchy hangs in the balance. The once silent palace erupted into chaos behind closed doors. Buckingham Palace, renowned for its ability to maintain composure in the face of scandal, was now in uncharted territory. Damage control teams were deployed like a wartime cabinet, Briefings were rewritten, appearances were recalibrated, and every movement was scrutinized for what it might imply. The monarchy wasn't just reacting, it was flailing. What Sophie had done wasn't a breach, it was a reckoning. And as her words echoed beyond palace gates, the power structures within began to destabilize. Camilla's loyalists, furious and shaken, lobbied for consequences. They framed Sophie's statement as an act of royal insubordination, a betrayal of the crown's sacred discretion. But for the first time in a long while, their voices weren't the only ones being heard. Charles, caught between his queen and the woman his mother once trusted implicitly, found himself in an impossible bind. In private, he pleaded for peace, urging both sides to maintain dignity and look ahead. But his actions revealed a far more complicated reality. Invitations were rescinded, access was altered. Sophie's visibility subtly reduced in palace programs. And while he never said it outright, insiders claim Charles made his loyalties painfully clear. He would not undermine Camilla, regardless of what the public thought. And the public had plenty to say. Because as the storm grew louder, so too did the sympathy for Sophie. In stark contrast to the palace's stiffness, the Prince and Princess of Wales remained silent. But their silence was anything but neutral. Keen observers noted the subtle gestures that suggested allegiance. Shared engagements with Sophie, warm embraces, small but deliberate choices that carried the weight of alignment. It wasn't spoken. It didn't need to be. The message was clear: Sophie was not standing alone. With each passing day, her image evolved. No longer the forgotten Duchess or the sidelined royal, she became a symbol of integrity, a woman who chose truth over tradition, transparency over theatrical unity, and in doing so, she found a new kind of power, one not handed to her by title, but earned through pain and principle. As public sentiment shifted, monarchists began asking uncomfortable questions. If this was what Sophie had endured in silence for years, what else was hidden behind palace walls? And more pointedly, was Camilla, now queen, fit to carry the symbolic weight of the crown while presiding over such division? The debate intensified. Polls reflected a noticeable dip in support for Camilla's role. Editorials began calling for greater transparency. The myth of royal infallibility was fracturing under the pressure of one woman's truth. But amid the storm, one question lingers above all. What now for Duchess Sophie? She was once the silent one, the dutiful figure in the background. But Duchess Sophie has found her voice, and in doing so, she may have just redefined what it means to be royal in the 21st century. In the wake of scandal, silence is often the expected path. But Sophie chose something far more daring. She chose to evolve. In a monarchy built on history, hierarchy, and hiding behind protocol, Sophie emerged from the shadows not with rage, but with resolve. Her transformation wasn't orchestrated by palace handlers or PR consultants, it was born from survival. The woman once overlooked now stands as a symbol of grace redefined. She didn't claim power, she claimed presence. Public engagements, once marked by routine, have become platforms of purpose. New patronages focused on mental health, female, empowerment, and institutional accountability have thrust her into global relevance. Interviews remain rare, but when she speaks, people listen. And not because she's royal, but because she's real. The public has taken notice. Where once she was the quiet consort, now she's the face of a shifting narrative. Not the one the monarchy crafted, but the one people are choosing. Sophie's story of betrayal, endurance, and finally, self-definition has resonated across borders. International media no longer refer to her simply by title. They call her the People's Duchess, the truth teller, the survivor of silence. Her courage to speak has ignited something that the firm never prepared for. Admiration rooted not in lineage, but in honesty. In a world where deference is being replaced by demand for authenticity, Sophie is no longer behind, she's ahead. What the Camilla conflict gave her, ironically, was clarity. Painful clarity, yes, but clarity nonetheless. She learned that silence may shield the system, but it suffocates the soul. That obedience, without voice, is erasure, and that no amount of tiaras or titles can substitute for the power of one woman standing in her truth. Her story is no longer just about what she endured, but what she reclaimed. And in reclaiming it, she didn't destroy the monarchy, she challenged it to evolve. She reminded the world that behind the palace walls are not just figureheads, but humans, flawed and fragile, capable of rising or falling depending on the choices they make when no one is watching. Sophie's legacy will not be defined by leaked recordings or distant relationships. It will be defined by a woman who was nearly written out, but rewrote her own chapter. A woman who was expected to fade quietly, but instead rose without vengeance. Her silence once protected others. Now, her truth protects herself. And in a monarchy built on tradition, perhaps Sophie has created a new tradition, one of transparency, accountability, and strength forged not by favor, but by fire. The crown may not be hers, but the narrative is, and in the court of public opinion, Duchess Sophie has already won. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.